Should I use different tactics if I'm fishing for wild versus stocked trout? We hear a version of that question all the time here at VFC, and it makes sense because for a lot of people, stocked fish are the only consistent trout fishing they've got access to. Wild and stocked trout are definitely unique critters, especially when you look at their behavior and their appearance, but those differences might not matter the way you think they do. This week on Untangled, we'll discuss the differences between wild and stocked trout and why those differences matter. From presentation to fly selection to telling them apart, you'll end this episode ready to catch any trout that crosses your path.
This is Untangled, fly fishing for everyone, presented by Ventures Fly Co.
Hey everybody, welcome to it. This is Untangled, and I am your host, Spencer Durant. I am not in the usual podcast studio this week, as you can tell if you're watching the video podcast. No, I am down in Utah this week, against my will. And there's not even any Diet Coke in this studio, which is an egregious party foul, but I won't let that stop me from delivering yet another week of podcast excellence. So we're going to dive right into our discussion about wild and stocked trout. Again, this is a question that we've been hearing a lot, especially lately from y'all, so I wanted to dedicate an episode to going through this. So we're going to start out by talking a little bit about why we stock trout. What's the whole point of doing that? Why is this a practice we use in the fishing world? We'll talk a little bit about hatcheries as well, for those who are unfamiliar with the hatchery world. And then we'll move right into all those differences between our wild and our stocked trout. So their appearance, their behavior, and then the flies and tactics that we're going to use to catch them. All of that is coming right up. But before we get to it, we need to define some terms real quick, because these will matter greatly as we go through this discussion today. And those would be the difference between a wild and a native trout. A wild trout, or a wild fish in general, is just a fish that was born and lived its entire life in the river. It has never lived inside a hatchery. It's completely wild. Its life was spent unencumbered by us humans, unless we put a hook in its lip and put it in the net, took a picture, put it on Instagram, made it famous, and then it went back to his buddies like, "Bill, you won't believe what happened to me today." Really, Charlie? Again? We told you, man. Those purple flies are fake. So that's your wild trout. Your native trout are trout that were in all of the rivers, the lakes, and the ponds here in America before we started settling this area, and then we started playing a little mad scientist with our fisheries. We scooped up brook trout and put them in the Rocky Mountains, and we put rainbow trout over on the East Coast where they don't belong. So before all of that happened, trout were native to specific areas of the country. Our brook trout were native here. Rainbows, brook trout, I already said those, lake trout and bull trout, and then cutthroat were all native to different parts of America when we got here. So there's no such thing as a native brown trout in America. So if you hear somebody say, "Oh, we killed those native browns," no, what they did was they caught a whole bunch of wild brown trout, because brown trout are native to Europe and then a tiny sliver of Africa. And this is important to remember because it segues into exactly why we have hatcheries in the first place and why we stock trout in rivers and lakes. Because our hatcheries are going to exist for two reasons. The first is that they're going to raise fish to a catchable size, and those fish are planted or stocked. You could use those terms interchangeably. They're planted or stocked into various water bodies, often for harvest. They call this it's a put and take fishery, is a phrase that gets used a lot. It's very similar to how we raise pheasants and chukar and other game birds and then release them before hunting season starts. If you've ever done bird hunting and you haven't had the opportunity to hunt wild pheasants, it's the same thing where we raise them in pens, we release them, we go out and get to hunt them. Is it the same as wild birds? Not really. And it's a very good corollary for trout as well. And we do this with fish. We stock them, we raise them in hatcheries, because in a lot of places there are problems with the river that prevents the fish from creating their own self-sustaining wild population. Because trout have pretty specific needs for spawning, for reproducing. And those circumstances aren't always present in a place like Missouri, for example. Not there's anything wrong with Missouri, but there's just not a lot of ideal trout spawning habitat in a place like that. So you'll end up stocking fish to keep that trout fishery going. And then on top of that, the rivers might only be the right temperature for trout to survive for certain portions of the year. So the trout will never survive unless they are consistently stocked and planted from a hatchery. So that's one reason the hatcheries exist. Now, the second reason that they exist is to supplement existing populations of wild and or native fish, and to help supplement the demand for sport fishing by stocking trout in rivers where our natural recruitment, which is biologists speak for how many fish successfully spawn and how many of those stream-born trout survive to adulthood. So if that natural recruitment is low, they'll go ahead and stock fish there to help them. A little interesting tidbit about this, the Green River in Utah, below Flaming Gorge. A lot of good brown trout, and the brown trout are wild there. They were stocked a long time ago, but they all reproduce. It's a self-sustaining wild population, but the rainbow trout don't. The natural recruitment for the rainbow trout is incredibly low on the Green. So most of those fish, those nice rainbows you're catching on the Green River, have been planted in the river. Now, they're planted very small, and we'll get into this in a minute, and they grow, and they look pretty good. They don't look like your typical stocked fish, but that population is supplemented heavily by stocking. Stocking fish also helps biologists manage the number of trout per mile, which helps them create fisheries that either support tons of fish, so you can go out just catch boatloads of them, or a few big fish, or something right in the middle. So it really helps them balance the numbers so they can balance the amount of food available to grow the biggest fish possible in a given river. And then again, stocked fish are going to give you that trout fishing opportunity where it just otherwise normally wouldn't exist. Now, in the case of supplementing existing populations of wild or native fish, a good example of what this looks like is with the cutthroat trout, because cutthroat face a lot of obstacles in being successful in the wild. Water quality is a big issue. Cutthroat need very clean, very clear, very cold water. And with all the development in the West, a lot of that being impacted. Water temperature, like I mentioned, and spawning habitat are big deals where the fish need it. The habitat's kind of being degraded a bit, not a bit out here, pretty substantially. So sometimes cutthroat will be planted in a stream at a fingerling size, and a fingerling, well, just for argument's sake today, we'll say they're fish between 3 to 6 inches. So little babies, just little cute guys, right? So these cutthroat will be planted as fingerlings to help supplement populations of native fish that have already been restored to their historical native range. So a lot of the high country, they'll go in, they'll plant cutthroat every couple of years just to help that population sustain itself on the landscape. And when it comes to supplementing these wild populations, trout are stocked to account for fish that die, fish that are harvested, and then again, that spawning success in certain fisheries. A lot of states supplement their wild trout populations with stocked fish, just like that example I gave about the Green River. They do that to keep their numbers up, keep the anglers happy, and just provide a good fishing experience for all of us. Utah, Wyoming, Idaho, Colorado, Oregon, and Washington all do that. Montana famously does not stock any trout in their rivers, though, and they haven't done that since 1974. The reason Montana doesn't do that, they will not stock trout in rivers, is there's actually a lot of science that shows hatchery fish have different genetics than wild fish, and those genetics can make these wild fish more prone to disease. It can also make the wild fish less resilient to changing water temperatures, so it can really dilute the genetics, especially when you look at native fish. The hatchery fish can sometimes dilute the genetics of them, which is why in a lot of places with our cutthroat or any of our other native fish, what the biologists will do, and I've actually gone out and helped them do this, is they'll set up these little traps on streams, and it'll trap all the spawning fish, and they'll harvest a bunch of the eggs and the milk from the fish and spawn them so they're almost wild-born fish. Almost, not quite, but they'll take those eggs and those milk, they'll take them back to a hatchery, raise them real quick, and then dump them in at a really small size so that they're not getting a hatchery strain of that cutthroat. And I'll dive more into that in a minute, but it's just interesting how they'll do stuff like that to try and keep the genetics as pure as possible out there on the landscape. And then if we look at the Midwest and then back east with hatcheries and whatnot, your trout stocking happens to supplement the wild populations of fish that already exist out there, or to give anglers a chance to catch trout during the time of year when river temps are low enough to support trout. And then it also gives us, again, this opportunity to put brook trout in Wyoming or cutthroat in Arkansas if we want, because we can raise and stock fish anywhere. We can play that mad scientist role, like I mentioned. Now, some folks will hate on stocked fish because this is fly fishing, and some people have to hate on something. It's just in their nature for whatever reason. There's nothing wrong with fishing for stocked trout. They give people opportunities to experience trout fishing, which is something very important that I think everybody needs to experience at least once, because catching trout on a fly rod out of a river is one of the coolest things you can do in this world. The fact that we've figured it out is pretty incredible, and it's something I think everybody should try at least once. So I love the fact that stock trout give people that opportunity, okay? But wild fish are certainly held in a higher regard than stocked fish, and then native trout are kind of at the top of the pyramid. But the pyramid really only exists because we always have to rank things in the world. Personally, for me, it comes down to when I catch a big, wild, native cutthroat, and I'm lucky to have a lot of good cutthroat fishing not far from me at all. So when I get into those big fish, I caught one that almost went 20 inches last year. It's a native cutthroat, and that's just a really unique experience because you're seeing a fish where it belongs, doing what it should, and it wasn't helped out. It wasn't born in a hatchery. It had to fight and grow to that size. It had to escape the otters and the eagles and the anglers. It had to overcome a lot to get to that size. It's very similar to when you harvest a really big public land deer or public land elk, because the obstacles those critters have to go through to get to that size is just incredible. So there's a lot of respect for it. So for me, I don't view it as, oh, well, I only catch wild native fish. I just appreciate the wild native fish because of what they represent. And then the stocked fish are really cool too. I catch plenty of stocked fish near where I live. One of the tailwaters gets like 10,000 rainbow trout stocked in it every year, and they grow big and they look cool and they're fun to catch. So, but it's not an argument of whether one is better than the other or whether catching one makes you better than the other. It's just a matter of appreciating what they both represent. So don't let people get down on you for catching stocked fish. It's just a silly thing to worry about, but there is something to catching those wild native fish, just being able to appreciate what it took for that fish to get there. It really is something special. So with all of that stuff out of the way, let's dive into the differences between our stocked and our native fish. And we're going to start, we've got their behavior, their appearance, the quality of the fish, and then the tactics. So we got 4 things to cover here, and let's start with the behavior. So when trout are stocked at a catchable size, which we'll just say is 10 inches or longer for sake of argument, they will have some notable behavior differences from wild trout, because stocked trout that go in as fingerlings, which again, anything up to about 5 or 6 inches in length, they won't exhibit these behaviors as strongly because they've had a little bit more time in the water to learn how to act wild. But the stock trout that go in at a catchable size are going to exhibit this behavior because they have been yanked from their hatcheries where they live in these concrete runs. It's literally just a concrete, like 3 or 4 feet deep, a couple of feet wide by like 100 feet long, just this trough, really. And that's where they spend their whole life. There's no cover. There's no structure. There's very little current. So even though it's instinctual for fish to seek out cover, the hatchery trout have never needed to. They've never practiced that. So that instinct is very rusty. So when they're freshly stocked, they'll hang out in weird spots. They'll hang out right in the middle without seeking the cover. And then they're very easy for anglers or birds or whatever to go catch because, again, they've never had to do it. So it's a very rusty instinct. So that is one big behavior difference you'll see is where the stocked fish hang out. Another big behavior difference is their feeding. Because when trout live in the hatchery, they are fed literally from these bags of Purina trout chow, which is just pellets, just pellets of food, and they get dumped on the water surface. So this trains all of those fish to look up for their food. They're not ever looking for nymphs. They're always looking up because that's where their food comes from. And because those pellets are hitting the water with a splash, it's not like we're delicately putting each pellet on the water. Just no drag. Just, land it like a butterfly with sore feet. Yeah. No, we're just tossing them out there to feed the fish, right? It also trains those hatchery fish to tolerate a lot of noise, a lot of drag, and a lot of disturbance on the water surface. Stuff that would normally scare a wild trout, the hatchery trout associate that with food, and they'll continue to do that even after they've been in the lake or river for a while after they get stocked. So it's very different. It's almost the opposite of what your wild fish will do. This also means that the fish are going to be a lot less picky about eating off the top. So they will eat flies with drag on them. They will not be spooked by a bad cast. And even after they've been in the water for a while, their instinct to look up for their food is going to be really strong, and they're going to take stuff off the top a little bit more readily than your wild trout will. Now, eventually, these stocked fish, if they survive, they will wise up. They'll learn to separate their real bugs from their fake ones, and that instinct to eat subsurface will kick in. But they'll still be just a little bit less discerning than wild trout who've had to fight and scrap for all of their food since birth. All right, let's talk about their appearance for a minute, because this is another area where stocked and wild fish vary greatly from each other. Your stocked fish are usually going to have some sort of damage to their fins, either their pectoral fins, which are the ones right behind their head, their dorsal fin, the one on top, or their tail fin. And that happens because they grow up in those concrete raceways. So their fins are going to get ground down from the rough texture of the concrete, because it's not just like there's one fish per raceway. No, there's thousands. It's very crowded. They're getting bumped into the concrete all the time. And that rough concrete's actually going to grind their fins down to just a little nub. And that's why they'll also, if you've ever caught a stocked fish with a really snubby, like a flat nose almost, it's really rough looking, kind of looks like it's been rubbed raw. It might be a little white and nasty as well. That's a dead giveaway that it's a stocked fish, because that will happen from running into the concrete all the time. Especially the longer they live in the hatchery, the more they'll exhibit those symptoms. If they're stocked as fingerlings, you usually don't see that, but if they're stocked at that bigger catchable size, you'll see a little bit of that damage. And then your stocked fish generally aren't going to be as colorful as their wild counterparts. The rainbow trout in particular tend to be pretty washed out. They're very silvery. Once they're in the river, they can start to look better. But usually that's kind of the exception and not the rule, because they spent so long eating this different diet, and then they're stocked, and then they're usually stocked again for catching. So they don't have time to take on the colors of their surroundings and to look pretty. The hatchery fish that are stocked as fingerling will look better because they've been eating that diet of actual bugs and not trout chow for their entire life. But those are generally the big differences in appearance that you're going to see between your stocked and your wild trout. Now we need to talk about the quality of the fish. I mentioned this a little bit earlier. There really is this big debate between one fish being better than the other. And again, I'm not looking down on stocked fish at all. They really create some wonderful opportunities for people to fish for trout who otherwise would never have that chance. But it is an actual scientific fact that stock trout have inferior genetics to wild trout, because stock trout are often the result of a captive or a brood stock. So this is a group of fish that lives almost their entire life in a hatchery, and their whole goal is just spawn every year. And so they'll just be spawned and spawned and spawned, and they live in this hatchery. So this brood stock is a group of fish that are selected for their ability to grow quickly in a hatchery environment, and then their resistance to diseases that crop up in hatcheries. They're not selected necessarily for their ability to survive in the wild. They're selected for their ability to thrive in a hatchery environment, which is completely different than the wild. So their offspring, they're going to spend that time, a little bit of time growing to that catchable size in the hatchery before they're stocked. So the genes just aren't the same. The genetics, the instincts, the life history just isn't the same as the wild fish, because these stocked fish aren't adapted to living in the wild like we just talked about. They don't have those same genetic inclinations as wild fish do. They haven't had to fight and scrap for their food. They haven't had to escape predators. And if any of these hatchery fish breed with wild fish, it can actually dilute the genetics to the point that the wild fish end up losing some of what makes them wild in the first place. And this isn't new either. This isn't something that's just cropped up. I actually found a paper from 1976 that discusses all of these problems and why there are issues with stocked versus wild fish. I'll link that in the show notes for anyone who wants some light reading, because who doesn't love a scientific paper? But stockfish do have their downsides because of this. And we use them to help supplement our wild native fish, our cutthroat, like I mentioned earlier. But most of those, they're harvested, like I mentioned. So they'll go out to a river or a lake. And this is actually very common. I've got a friend who's a biologist in Utah, a fish biologist, and he managed a couple of different cutthroat broods. So he had 2 or 3 different lakes, if I remember correctly, where every spring when cutthroat spawn, they would go to all these lakes. They would collect some fish. They would spawn them right there at the lake. So they didn't kill them, but they harvest their eggs, harvest their milk. It's actually a pretty interesting process. You just like run your finger down the belly of the fish and all the eggs pop out. It's kind of cool and disgusting at the same time. But they'll do that, and they'll keep the eggs in one place and the milk in another place. And then they'll take those, they'll combine them together so that the eggs fertilize, and they'll raise those fish to, again, that small fingerling size, that 3 to 6 inches. And then those will get stocked everywhere that they need fish. And the reason they do this is to preserve those wild genetics, because those fish spend as little time in the hatchery as possible. And their genetics are all wild. They're not from a captive broodstock in a hatchery. They're from wild fish. So at that point, the genetic impact doesn't happen. But when you have a bunch of wild rainbows, for example, and then you stock a whole bunch of stock rainbows on top of them, if those two start to breed together, that's when you can run into some issues. So there is a legitimate quality difference between the two fish, just at the genetic level, and that matters for the quality of our fisheries moving forward, because we should want the fish that are the toughest, that have won the natural selection process, because that's going to provide the best fishing experiences for a lot of us, I think, in the future. So that is just one big difference and again, we could spend an entire episode just on that, but I thought it was worth bringing up here. And last but not least, the one y'all have been waiting for, the tactics. Okay, this is the question that we hear all the time. What tactics do I need to catch stocked fish? What fly should I use? Where do I find all of these stocked fish? Well, the answer is incredibly simple. Do everything that you do for a wild trout. Stocked fish are easier to catch. They're less discerning about a bad drift. They're certainly less discerning about fly selection. And that all works to your advantage, because that means You don't have to be perfect right out of the gate. If you live near an area where stocked fish are your only trout fishing option, you're going to have, well, I shouldn't say you're going to, there's a very good chance that you will have a little bit easier of a time than someone learning to fly fish on the Madison River in Montana, where those fish see a bajillion flies per day and a quintillion anglers per year, it feels like. Because those stocked fish, again, they're going to be less discerning. They're going to be a little bit easier. But why would you settle for substandard drifts, substandard presentation, substandard fly selection when learning to make a good drift, correctly matching the hatch, and reading water is going to benefit you in the long run? Because eventually, I think a lot of us aren't only ever going to fish for stock trout. We'd like to make our trip out west, or maybe go to the driftless in the Midwest, or maybe back east for the brook trout, or any of the great brown trout fishing up in the Catskills, right? We're going to want those opportunities at some point. So the tactics that you should use for stock trout are going to be the same ones that we've talked about here at VFC. This is episode 126. So for 125 episodes, we've talked about put your fly in front of a fish, make it look real. That's your job as an angler. Focus on reading the water. Put your flies where you think the fish are going to be. Match the hatch as best as you possibly can. When you can focus on doing those things, you're going to catch the stock trout. And then you're also going to develop the skill set that will help you become a great angler, not just for wild trout, but also for bass or pike or even saltwater. Because again, we did an episode about this a while ago where there's a lot of crossover between the skill set you need for a whole bunch of different species. So it makes sense to just do the best you can to try and perfect your skills as much as possible, because even though you don't need a perfect drift to catch that stocked fish, why would you settle for something that's a little substandard? And then eventually, too, a lot of these hatchery fish, they're still going to be hanging out in riffles. They're going to be hanging out in pools, runs. They're going to be on the seams. They're still going to key in on hatches of mayflies and caddis, and some of them will turn their nose up at really bad presentations that will happen. So even with some of the hatchery fish, you still need a really good presentation. So again, your goal should be present your flies as perfectly as you can, as if you're fishing for wild trout all the time, because then you're going to hone your skills to where if you do run into wild fish, you're going to be set instead of just settling for that presentation that's good enough for stocked fish. So hopefully that helps. You don't have to worry about, you don't need a separate fly box for stocked fish versus wild fish. Match what's in the water, because even though these stocked fish, if they're fresh off the hatchery truck, they might see a stonefly nymph for the first time and think, oh, what the heck is that? But they are still a trout. They still have however many thousands of years of genetic instincts telling them to eat that thing. They're still going to go over and eat it. They just may not know what it is, okay? There's no reason to have those different flies because they're going to eat the same thing. Hone your skills up as best you can. So hopefully that helps. If you guys have any more questions about stock versus wild trout, feel free to let me know. But we are going to move on to the Q&A section of this week's show.
Nothing is worse than hooking into a big fish only to have your knot break halfway through the fight. Setting up your rod and tying knots can be confusing and frustrating, especially if you're unsure if it's going to work. That's why we put together our Rigs and Knots Pocket Guide. It has instructions and tips on how to set up the most time-tested, proven, reliable fly fishing rigs step by step. So if you want to spend less time tinkering and more time fishing with confidence, click or tap the link in the show notes to get this guide for free. All right, back to the show.
Every week here at Untangled, we spend half the show directly answering questions from listeners and viewers just like yourself. And often the questions y'all send in become the basis for the open of the show as well, like we just saw. So if you've got a fly fishing question that you would like answered, you go ahead and send those in. There's a link to do that in the show notes, or there should be fancy dancy QR code around here. If you are watching and want to scan the QR code and send it in that way, feel free. But let's go ahead and start out with Aaron from Utah. He has our first question this week. Writes in and says, Spencer, I'm a little over 2 years into fly fishing and started it all with a session with a guide. I've hit a familiar pattern. Research, invest, head up to the river, fail to land anything. How many trips do I have to have before I invest in another guide or quit? Well, Aaron, I've been there. Okay. Believe me, I have been there. I used to keep a fish journal pretty regularly, and I actually looked back through mine when I read your question. And I found this stretch of about a month's worth of trips. And this is back when I was fishing close to 300 days a year, which that sounds really fun. And it was. I don't regret it at all. But you want to talk about an easy way to burn yourself out on something you love. Go 300 times in a year. And it's a great way to lose jobs, lose friendships, never really date because you just spend all your time with the fish. And then, grandma starts to ask questions about you. Spencer ever going to get married? I don't know, grandma. Get off my back. Anyways, I was fishing quite a bit back then. The whole point of that is I was fishing quite a bit back then. And there's a month stretch, so quite a few trips where I got skunked for a solid month. Didn't catch jack squat. So these stretches of tough fishing happen. They happen to everybody. Might be to different degrees, but they're going to happen to everybody. And especially to beginners who are starting out. If you don't have a guide with you every time, or you don't have a friend showing you the ropes, it's very easy to make mistakes you're not even aware of and prevent yourself from catching fish. But before I get into any of the advice, I do have a question for you. Because you mentioned that you're investing after your research, and I'm not quite sure what you mean by that. Are you buying new gear every time you get skunked? Because that is definitely not necessary. So don't drain your bank account like that. The reason that we don't catch fish is almost always because we fail at putting our fly in front of a fish or making it look real, or both. That's our job as an angler, is put a fly in front of a fish, make it look real. If you fail at one or both of those things, you're going to have a hard time catching fish, and new gear is not going to fix that. As much as I love my fishing with my bamboo rods and my expensive stuff, and they don't make me a better angler. I just enjoy using those things. They don't make this noticeable difference in my skill level. Okay. Now, if you were out fishing last month and all you had in your fly box were caddis imitations, then yeah, it's probably a good idea to invest in some mayflies and midges, because this past month, the caddis, I've seen a few, but it's only been very recently. It's still been mostly mayflies and midges that have dominated, a few stoneflies as well. So if you needed to go out and get some mayflies and midges, you're 30, maybe $40 into new flies to get a couple of patterns just to see what's working. So that might be the only real investment that you would need to make. But what it sounds like to me, the issue here is that you're probably fishing where the fish aren't, meaning that you're casting to the wrong type of water. Especially this time of year, you're looking for walking speed water. It's moving about 1 to 2 feet per second. And you're looking specifically for riffles, runs, and seams, because that's where the fish are going to be holding. And a seam is just where fast and slow water meet. Fish love to hold in seams because they can just sit in the slow water. And then when food comes by in that fast water, they can dart out, grab it, go back into the slow water. Because remember, fish are just like me. They're lazy SOBs. They don't want to do anything they don't have to do. So they're going to spend the least amount of energy possible for the most amount of food. So hanging out in a seam, honestly, it's a great gig. If you can get it, you should go get it. So I would really focus on dialing in your ability to read water. That is where I would spend time. That was where I would spend my research time. And then once you feel comfortable there, I would also focus on getting a drag-free drift. When we talk about a drag-free drift, all that means is that your flies are drifting naturally in the current. It's very easy to visualize with a dry fly, because if you dropped a leaf on the water, you would watch that leaf float down the river and it would get bounced around and moved around by the current. Okay. If that leaf started to move differently, you'd see a little wake behind it. You'd see some unnatural movements on it. That's what drag is. And that would tell you that, hey, something's up with that leaf. It's not right. That's how fish can tell that your fly is fake, because if it's got that little wake behind it, if it's moving opposite the current, it's not moving with the current, that tells the fish something about it is wrong, because real bugs don't do that. So a drag-free drift is very, very valuable to your ability to catch fish. So we've also got a whole bunch of resources to help with this. We've got an ebook on reading water, and then some videos on presentations. I'll go ahead and link that ebook in the show notes. Those videos will be in the show notes as well. And then there should be, we're trying out something fancy here this week, and I'm in charge of it. So if it doesn't work, I'm sorry, but there should be a QR code on the screen as well for those who are watching the show. So thank you, Aaron. Definitely, if you've got more questions, follow up with me so we can help dial in this stuff, because don't want you quitting. All right, there's no reason to quit. You're going to figure it out. There can be a tough learning curve sometimes. Don't give up, and don't go out buying a new fly rod every time you don't catch fish. I don't want you to get bankrupt. All right. So holler if there's anything else we can do for you, man. Appreciate it. Connor from Utah has our next question. Writes in and says, recently I was on the river for an insane caddis hatch, and there were thousands of bugs on the water. I was able to catch a couple on dries and a couple on nymphs, but was confused because even with that many bugs, I wasn't seeing that many rising fish. My question is, why does this sometimes happen, that there is so much bug life but little surface action? Connor, this is a really great question. Props to you for being so observant when you're out there on the water. That's a skill just like anything else. And I don't think people understand what's the best way for me to phrase this. Almost everything in fly fishing is a skill. There's very few things that we do in fly fishing that we do in our day-to-day lives, like observing rising fish. Who just goes to the river and watches them, right? Wading in the river. Who just goes and walks in the river for fun? That's a skill that you've got to develop. Obviously, you're casting, watching your flies on the surface of the river. That's a skill we've all got to develop. And if you don't fish a whole lot, you're not going to practice those skills very much, because, again, those are things we just don't do. So almost everything is a skill in this sport, and observing is one of the best skills you can develop. So big props to you, Connor, for making that observation. And it's actually funny that you sent your question when you did, because this same thing happened to me and Alex just 2 weeks ago, I think. We were out fishing. There were tons of caddis everywhere, and the fish weren't really keyed in on them. When Alex saw all the caddis, he had to tie one on, and he got one fish to come up and eat it, but Alex was having a tough day with hook sets, and he missed that fish. And I felt really bad for him, because I felt bad for Alex, because I've been in that exact situation where it seems like every hook set you make is wrong. You can't keep the fish on. And then it's worse when we're filming, because it's like, we need fish. We need fish for the video. So it was, I've been there. So my heart went out to him. But anyways, we were in a very similar situation just a couple weeks ago. And the reason that this happens, one reason that we could use to explain it, is the caddis life cycle itself, because it's a little bit different than mayflies and midges. Caddis, they hatch, they emerge into adults, just like every other aquatic insect. But then they fly away to the branches, the bushes, and the trees, the grass, all near the river. And they can spend, if I'm recalling my information correctly, roughly a month living outside of the water. Mayflies spend very little time. They don't have mouths as adults, because they don't need to eat, because from the time they hatch into an adult to when they mate and die is a very, very short time frame. Caddis, completely different. Okay, caddis are going to spend a significant amount of time outside of the water, growing, getting ready to mate. Then once they're ready to do that, they all come back to the river together in these giant swarms. That's probably what you saw. And they do that to lay their eggs. So at this point, when you see these big swarms coming back, an egg-laying caddis could be a great pattern to try. But if you're not seeing many rising fish, then it's probably because the caddis aren't close enough to the water for the fish to eat yet. If they're, 2, 3, 4 feet above the water, some fish will jump that high, but I mean, they're not going to jump that high to try and snag one midair when they could just eat a nymph under the surface. So that's one potential reason for it. Or the fish are just keyed in on and eating something else, because this time of year, there's midges and mayflies hatching as well. So maybe they're eating those instead of the caddis. Because again, from the fish's point of view, which bug are you going to chase? Are you going to go after the caddis that's barely touching the surface once or twice every couple of seconds, laying its eggs, and the chance of actually eating it is pretty small? Or are you going to go for the nymph that's underwater where you as the fish already are? Okay, again, the nymph's a safer bet. The fish are going to chase that safer bet fairly often because they want to spend the least amount of energy for the most amount of food. So sometimes, so that can explain why maybe they weren't really rising too much on the caddis. And then sometimes there really just is, hatches can be fantastic. They can be the stuff legends and dreams are made of, and the fish just aren't interested in eating off the top. Just this year, there's been 2 or 3 times where we've been in a hatch and I've looked at the buddies that I've been fishing with and said, I don't understand why the fish aren't eating. And we all just kind of shrug and there's no explanation for it. It's just something that happens sometimes. I wish I had an explanation for you. I don't know if there's one out there that exists. Sometimes they're just not going to eat off the top for whatever reason. But if you do want to learn some more about caddis, we've actually got a video in our fly selection masterclass. I'll link that in the show notes for you as well. So thanks for the question. I appreciate it. Evan from Pennsylvania has our next question, writes in and says, Dear Spencer, loving the podcast and all things VFC. I can't get enough. I have 2 questions. How many of the same fly, same size, shape, and color should I carry or buy at once? Lately, I've been picking up a wide variety, but only one of each. The problem is, in the back of my mind, I know that at any moment, that one fly could end up stuck high in a tree. Also, here's a question that's been bugging me. If you hook a fish and it pops off right at your feet, does that still count as a catch? What, in your opinion, has to happen for a fish to officially count? Evan, good question. Thanks, ma'am. So your first question. I've talked about this a lot, but I really only have like 2 dozen patterns that I use on a regular basis that are consistently in my fly boxes. And the evolution for a lot of anglers, I think, is to do exactly what you're doing. You start out and you want a bunch of flies. So you get a whole bunch of different patterns. You're trying all the new stuff. You want to see what works, and you just want to have fun with it, because it is fun to try all these new flies and look at them. But then eventually, if you're fishing consistently in the same area, you realize that you're going to catch most of your fish on the same few patterns. And even if it's not really in the same area, Alex and I get to fish across the West every year. We have some awesome opportunities to travel quite a bit. Our fly selection really doesn't change too much across the West. It really stays pretty similar no matter where we go. So we just have a lot of those few patterns in our box. Or you'll be the guy who carries like 2,000 flies with him to the river every time he goes fishing, which is not bad. It's not wrong. But a lot of the anglers I know tend to outgrow that stage at some point and really just settle on their couple of patterns that they feel good with. So when I sit down and tie flies during the winter, what I like to do is tie an even dozen of a certain fly. So I'll have a dozen size 12 Adams, a dozen size 14, a dozen size 16, and continuing on. That way I can last for a while with those dozen flies that I tied. But then there are some flies that I don't tie as many of. Middle of summer, I'm going to be pretty low on sparkle duns because I'll have focused on tying up caddis emergers instead, because the caddis are the main thing on the menu. Mayflies are less important at that point. So what I'm trying to say really is my favorite response to every question that we get at VFC, which is, it depends. But I'd say, like, at a bare minimum, if I had to put a number on it, 4 of each fly should be enough to get you through a day on the water, unless you're really donating a ton to the trees that day. Eventually you'll figure out a number that works good for you. And then as to your last question, when does a fish officially count? Well, you have to hold the fish for exactly 3.7 seconds, completely submerged. And if you don't get a picture and upload that picture to Instagram, geotagged with where you caught it, where you were standing, what direction you were facing, the fly you were using, the angle of your cast, the angle of the sun, the phase of the moon, and whether or not Mercury was in retrograde, then no, it does not count as a catch. No. It's completely up to you, man. There's no rule there. There's some days where I'm out fishing, and if I don't put a fish in the net, it will get under my skin, and it'll bother me if I'm hooking and losing a lot of them and not really putting them in the net. Then other days, if I see them rise, I hook them and they get off, I'm fine with it. It doesn't really bother me too much. But if I'm going to tell somebody, if someone asks, how many fish you catch today? I'll answer with whatever ones I put in the net. To me, that's what it means. But if it pops off at your feet, I reckon that's close enough to count, but it's up to you, man. So again, figure out something that works, because it depends. And with that, folks, we are going to wrap up the Q&A section, but don't go anywhere, because we've got the Live Real Life moment coming right up. Every week, we end the show by sharing a story and some pictures from folks out there in the VFC audience who are living real life. I love to read your stories, see the pictures, and hear about the adventures y'all are taking. So if you've got a Live Real Life moment that you would like to share, you can go ahead and submit those at the link in the show notes. And this week's Live Real Life moment is from Josh. Writes in and says, I'm brand new to fly fishing and have been practicing my cast and learning from resources like Ventures Fly Co. for months now. Living in Boston, Massachusetts, I don't have many trout streams nearby, but I enjoy backpacking in the White Mountains. So I made a trip up to Lincoln, New Hampshire for a weekend of fishing the East Branch of the Pemigewasset. Hope I got that right. Pemigewasset River. After many rookie mistakes, forgetting that 4X is my thickest tippet instead of the thinnest, sinking my dry fly with too large of a nymph, and using too small of a parachute Adams to pick it out from the bubbles on the water, I finally found a dry dropper rig that worked, an elk arcatus with a small nymph. I spent a whole day fishing and eventually caught 5, almost had a 6th, brook trout, 2 little ones and 3 of modest size for a mid-sized river. The last one I caught with one of my last few casts as rain clouds moved in and a handsome brookie took the dry fly. It was so exciting to see that fish appear out of nowhere, a dark movement under the water, and strike my fly. Another fun encounter was catching one of the little ones. I watched him make a half dozen attempts to take my dry fly, but it was just too big for him. Eventually, he played ball and took the nymph that was more his size. It was such a fun interaction over a series of casts to this one plucky native fish. Such a great day along the river, catching my first trout on the fly. Thank you for the great podcast. While it's of course informative, I find it is also great to fill the fly fishing itch between my opportunities to get on the water. Also, big thanks to the local fly shop in Lincoln, New Hampshire, Mountain High Fly, for helping me get some little nymphs and appropriate dry flies and giving pointers for the river. Josh, that's fantastic. That's freaking fantastic, man. That's so cool. Thanks for all the kind words you said, and thanks for sending this story in. My sister's actually in Boston right now. She's going to law school out there, so it's good to know that there's some good fishing not too far away, because I got to go visit her sometime soon. But anyways, great little story. Congrats on sticking with it. And yeah, sometimes those little fish, it's fun to watch them try and eat like an entire grasshopper when the hopper's bigger than they are. So it's so much fun. That's what it's all about, man. Getting out there and having those experiences and seeing those cool things. So thanks a bunch, Josh. I appreciate it. And with that, folks, we are going to wrap the show up. Thank you so much for being here with us. Watching the whole show means a lot to us. And if you could, please rate and subscribe to the show wherever you're listening to it, because the more ratings and subscriptions we get, the more folks we can help live real life, which is the entire goal of what we're doing here at VFC. And with that in mind, go get out on the water. The weather's great. Go catch some fish. Have a blast. And until next week, everybody, live real life.